Great. Appreciate the chance to be here. Maria, she's an undergraduate at Stanford. She did a lot of the substantive work in this paper, but I'll actually do the presentation for various reasons. But just to say, broadly, our lab does a lot of work on trying to build algorithms that can reason about human emotion, both in terms of how emotion influences decision-making, but also trying to infer how to influence or perhaps perceive the emotional states of others. And so this paper falls within a line of that work. And Maria was a summer intern at our lab when this work was done. So and here's their faces because we can't meet in person, unfortunately. So we often use economic games to study human social cognition because there's a rich tradition on how to use these techniques to sort of narrow in and control certain aspects that we care about. Economic games are interesting because arguably by paying people money, they're making kind of more realistic decisions than they might in other laboratory tasks. And we can measure their actual behavior in these tasks and explore interactions between, say, a player and their partner. And this is a long line of research that's led to fairly mature frameworks for characterizing quote unquote rational decision-making in social contexts, largely driven by work on game theory. So just an example, and this is the task that we examine in this paper. The iterated prisoner's dilemma is typically framed as a task between two participants where they, over several rounds, repeatedly make a decision between sort of, do they try to split or do they try to steal a pot of money with their opponent? And they're given an explicit payoff function that describes how much money they would make on a given round based on the joint decision that's sort of done privately, but then revealed simultaneously on a given round. So if we both cooperate, say, for example, we might each get $5. And so there's an incentive to cooperate. But then there's a temptation to screw over our opponent. So if I can get them to cooperate and I steal, then I can get the whole pot of money. And there's also fear of being exploited. And if you do the game theoretic analysis, it says that you should, in fact, not cooperate with your partner. But empirically, in fact, people cooperate much more than would be expected by this rational analysis. And in this particular game, those who are irrational make more money. And it's been argued that emotion explains these departures from rational choice. And so there's a fair amount of research trying to unpack what role emotion plays. And you can kind of broadly categorize that into two categories of work. One work really focuses on the emotions of the player. So based on what that player feels, how might that shape their actions? And those feelings come from many possible sources. For example, one source of emotion might be just anticipating what might happen if I do different choices. And that sort of anticipated emotion can influence the decisions. And this has been, by some like Fair and Schmidt, characterized mathematically in terms of that we don't just care about money, which would be self-interest, but we might, for example, fear being exploited. And so that serves as kind of a negative utility when we're thinking of our decision. But we also might feel guilty about the thought of exploiting our partner, which also might lead to negative affect. And depending on how much we weight, sort of guilt versus fear, that might influence the decision we make in the task. But of course, also emotion could be coming from, is it a rainy day or sunny day outside? And so there's also a line of work that tries to experimentally induce sort of a general mood, I would say, on the player, say, have them watch a disgusting video before they play this task, and then see how does that induced emotion influence people's decisions. And of course, emotion can also arise within the task. So if I get screwed over, you might expect I might feel angry and want to retaliate. And so other lines of research try to manipulate those actions and see to what extent that influences an emotion that might lead to a decision. So that's kind of the line of work that focuses on the player, but there's a whole nother line of work that really focuses more on the signaling of emotion from the other player that I observe that I'm playing with. So when we're playing a game, obviously our opponent is playing some policy that in response to our own choices. If they're doing a fixed policy, like, I don't know, cooperating 25% of the time, we're no longer in the realm of game theory. We can just use reinforcement learning to solve that task. But more generally, people are doing a conditional strategy where they're doing something in response to what we're doing and what they think we're doing. And so various contingent strategies include something like tit for tat. So if I cooperate, then my opponent will cooperate with me in the next round. And there's various variations of that. But in terms of emotion, the question is, if I can see the signals my partner is expressing, their facial expressions, for example, can that or does that shape my own decision-making? And the argument is that expressions may reveal something about my partner's goals and their decision-making policy, so therefore I know how to best respond to them. So just to give an example of this, the observation is, so if we go back to the prisoner's dilemma game and we're playing a particular round with the gentleman on the right and he smiles, we might ask, well, how does that signal influence the way I should play on the subsequent round? And what that research has shown, and Celso de Melo, one of the co-authors of the paper, has done much of this work, is that expressions in these games do influence outcomes, but the way they influence depends on context, in particular, the context of the action that just co-occurred around that expression. So for example, if we've just cooperated together and my partner smiles, that seems to signal to me that they have cooperative intentions. They have the goal of mutual cooperation. And therefore, that should probably lead me to continue to cooperate with them on the subsequent round. Where on the other hand, if they've just screwed me over and they show the exact same smile, that leads to very different interpretation. So they seem to be communicating that they enjoyed screwing me over. Therefore, they probably have the intention to compete rather than cooperate. And therefore, probably I shouldn't cooperate with them on the next round. And what you can show experimentally is you can create different agents that show different patterns of emotional expressions in response to different events. So for example, a cooperative agent might show joy after mutual cooperation, but guilt if it screws you over, communicating that that was an accident. Whereas competitive pattern of expressions might be to smile after screwing you over and show guilt after cooperating because it just missed the opportunity to screw you over on that round. And so these different patterns argued to communicate different goal orientations that the partner has towards this game, and that observers see these expressions and try to recover the action policy of the partner and use that as information. And you can show that by creating agents with different patterns of expression, even if they use the same policy like tit for tat, we can influence cooperation rates in these games. Okay, so what's new? So that's a lot of work around this very specific task. So our focus, well, if we go back to the role of expressions, what I've just described, expressions typically are viewed as information. So they signal some information to me about what my partner's action policy might be, therefore influence beliefs about that policy. So here we asked a somewhat different question, which has not been typically explored, which is, might those expressions somehow directly influence player emotion and therefore indirectly influence the actions that they might participate in? We hypothesized that the pattern of my partner expressions might influence the player's emotion because they might, for example, feel better when they cooperate with a partner who's showing that they have a cooperative goal orientation. And they might feel better exploiting their partner if their partner has communicated that they have a competitive goal orientation. So that's the question that we ask in this particular paper. Okay, so to do this, we took an existing corpus of data that was collected by Melo and Professor Terada at Gifu University. So we had about 320 participants that played a 20-round game, and you can kind of think of this as about 6,500 decisions that people have played across these games. The game itself was framed as an investment game, so there was no they couldn't figure out what was the cooperative or competitive choice just from the interface. They had to look at the incentive structure to figure that out. And these were players recruited from Mechanical Turk. They were told they would play another Turker and that they could see their partner's expressions. And then they were compensated based on their performance. In reality, they actually played a scripted agent, and they were debriefed about this deception after the study. And then the design is a 2x2 experimental design. So agents were manipulated in two ways. The partner, on one independent factor, we manipulated the pattern of emotional expressions that the agent would show. So a cooperative pattern would say show joy after mutual cooperation. A competitive pattern would show joy after screwing you over. And then they saw these sort of artificial expressions you see on the bottom. And then independently of that, we manipulated the partner's decision policy. So these are two variations of tit for tat that have been proposed in the literature. They're called zero determinant strategies. They're essentially probabilistic tit for tat. And so generosity, tit for tat, you cooperate if your partner cooperated in the last round, you defect if you your partner defected on the last round. So generosity strategy, if your partner cooperated, you always cooperate on the next round. If your partner screwed you over, you mostly screw them back, but you try a little bit to get them to cooperate again. So there's with some probability you'll cooperate again. Extortionist is kind of the opposite. If you screw over the extortionist, it'll always screw you over. If you cooperate with the extortionist, it may cooperate, but it also might try to screw you over. And so these are kind of more selfish versus a more selfless agent, but probabilistic to make it a little harder for the person to infer the strategy. And then after each round in this game, people would self-report how they felt about that particular outcome in the game. So played round one, we mutual cooperate. I choose, was I happy? Did I regret? Do I feel anger? Neutral. So that results in kind of a database of a large number of decisions. And we know for each of these decisions, how did the player say they felt? And then we know the previous pattern of expressions and decisions that partner made. And then we know what the player decides next. And so the question is, we're asking this paper is, how do these experimental conditions impact what the participant says they feel about a joint outcome, but then also what might they do on the next round? So can we predict how those feelings might influence subsequent decisions? So these are the results. Let me sort of walk through what this complicated chart shows. So you're seeing actually 4 graphs here. In each of these graphs, what you're seeing is the proportion of participants that reported a particular feeling in response to a round. So the different bars are different feelings. And then these are organized first by the outcome. So what just happened in that round? Did they have mutual cooperation? Did I screw over my opponent? Did they screw me, or was there mutual defection? Okay, so here we're seeing that generally speaking, when we have mutual cooperation, most participants, about 60%, report feeling joy at that event. And then on the left, these leftmost graphs, we're showing the 2 conditions where the partner showed a competitive pattern of expression. So these are where my player, if I was a participant, would smile when they screwed me over, versus over here, we're seeing people who play agents that would smile after mutual cooperation. And then on these rows, what we're seeing are the different decision policies that the agent would play. So in these 2 charts, the partner played the extortionist strategy, meaning it was trying to screw over the participant through its decision policy, whereas these bottom two charts are showing participants that played a generosity agent. So this agent was trying to establish cooperation with the participant. Okay, so with that said, what we see is there's a strong impact of the immediate outcome on what people say they feel. Perhaps not surprisingly, most participants report that they are joyful when they manage to establish mutual cooperation with their partner on a particular round. And we see less joy at exploiting their partner. So about 50% of people said they were happy at screwing over their partner in this task, in this condition. But we also see that this pattern changes, and in this case reverses, depending on the other experimental factors. So in this case, what we're seeing is that more people actually report joy at screwing over their partner than achieving mutual cooperation. And so to drill down on this, in this paper, to drill down on this little more detail, we focused on joy because this was the emotion that was reported most by participants. And we calculated a new measure, which we're calling a selfless pattern of feeling, which is essentially to what extent do people tend to report more joy at cooperation minus the extent that they felt joy at screwing over their partner. So those who are sort of the most focused on mutual cooperation would have the largest amount of these selfless feelings, and those who are most interested in screwing over their partner would have a negative value on that. So they're showing more competitive feelings. So that's what this chart shows. So let me walk you through what we're seeing here. So first thing we're seeing is that there's a large impact of the partner's facial expressions, the pattern of expressions they show, on the extent to which people report these selfless feelings. So those participants that played a cooperative partner, meaning a partner that smiled when it cooperated with them, tended to smile when they cooperated with that partner, or tended to feel, reported feeling more joy back to partners that smiled when they mutually cooperated with them. In contrast, what we see is people that played an agent that smiled when it screwed them over tended to report more joy when they screwed it back and less joy at mutual cooperation. So we're seeing that the pattern of emotional expressions, independent of the agent's actual behavior, the pattern of expressions this agent shows influences the extent to which we feel sort of joy at mutual cooperation. In contrast, the actual behavior of the agent, did it screw us over or not, had much less of an effect on these self-reported feelings. So in general, we feel more joy at mutual cooperation when our partner is actually cooperative, but the feelings were more influenced by the expressions of the partner, not the partner's actual behavior, which we found somewhat puzzling. So just to kind of reinforce that takeaway, we define this measure called selfless feelings, which is sort of feeling good after mutual cooperation minus feeling good after exploiting your opponent. And what we see is the proportion of participants that had selfless versus selfish feelings was shaped by the partner's expression far more than the actual decisions of that partner. And in terms of possible mechanisms, it might be, I wouldn't say we have a strong argument as to what the mechanism is, but it may be something like norm internalization. So if your partner signals joy after exploiting you, maybe that suggests that you don't need to feel guilty in this particular context. Within this context, the norm is let's be competitive and feel less guilt at screwing over your partner. And therefore that will influence the feelings in this task. How does this actually impact player behavior? So we then analyzed if these feelings could predict the decision people make on the subsequent round. And here we see actually a relatively small impact of felt emotion. It's more important what your partner actually did than what they signaled in terms of what you're actually going to do on the next round. So these self-reported feelings seem to have a relatively weak link on immediate behavior. So people in these tasks are acting sort of more strategically, not emotionally, if you believe that we're actually indexing true emotion. There's a number of limitations to this work. First, because we have to replicate this in other tasks, but one of the questions we had is, do these recall we're asking people what they say they felt. Does that really reflect emotion? And so we don't have, for example, quote unquote, objective measures of, say, physiological arousal or brain activation. It's also possible that participants could have believed their partner could see their emotions. And so maybe what they're engaging in is impression management or emotion regulation. So we need to, one of the planned studies is to more carefully unpack the extent to which people believe they're being perceived or not. Note also, we really drilled down on this particular paper on joy as an emotion, but there are other differences observed in the data. For example, the amount of neutral reported after mutual defection varies considerably by condition. They feel less emotion after mutual defection when the partner followed an extortionist decision policy. And some other data suggests this may be because they just expected to be screwed over, and so therefore it's sort of less emotional when that event occurs. Another obvious limitation is that what we did in these tasks is people are interacting with an agent that they believe represents a person, but is showing very stylized expressions. And so a typical interaction would look something like this, where there's a real human here. They're seeing these very stylized expressions on their partner, and then they're using that information to somehow inform their own decision-making. But, you know, in a real interaction, people can see the face of the other. And so a whole nother line of our research is involved in putting people in basically Zoom meetings where they can play this game and record their expressions. And what you see here is that the expressions are quite complex. You don't have, I mean, of course, people smile, but they do all kinds of interesting complex behaviors. They seem to be mirroring or interacting with each other, almost like a conversation with these expressions. And so we have a fair amount of work trying to look at both what, if any, relationship is there between what people say they feel and what they show on their face, but then also how do people interpret these expressions? Are they trying to predict what this person is feeling and using that information, and are they good at it? And the takeaway is that people are not particularly good, nor are machines particularly good at making sense of these rich affective signals. So just to kind of step back and review, what I try to outline is that emotions shape feelings and decisions in social tasks in various ways, both in terms of how we feel, but what we signal to others. And this particular paper, we really focused on this understudied link of how expressions of partner might influence our own feelings. If you're interested in this topic, I'll also mention that we're running the meeting of the International Society for Research on Emotion in Los Angeles next summer in person, hopefully. And abstracts are due this Sunday. And so if your research touches on the topic of emotion, we would most welcome the opportunity to see you in LA this coming summer. And with that, I'll stop, and we probably have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have one question here in Slack from Pat Langley. Why have you applied this to poker? Haven't you applied this to poker? Facial expressions, both real and faked, are crucial here. Yeah. Maybe your system could collect research funds in online competitions.
Yeah, so we do have one paper on poker. I think we were trying to predict how expressions of the partner influence a person's decision to fold or not, and have some evidence that machines might be able to do slightly better than a human on that task. I mean, poker is a very interesting task in that it involves a lot of strategic manipulation of various kinds. So I'm definitely interested in collecting that. One of my actually students is a professional poker player, and she made more money during her time at my lab playing poker than she did through her GRA assistantship. And she also used these amazing manipulation tactics, like she would dress up like Hello Kitty outfits and act like she knew nothing about poker, and then go clean up on all these guys at the local casino.
Okay, we have another question. Have you looked into what aspect emotions lean into nudges for cooperation? From
Yeah,
Ben Wright.
Yeah, so obviously in this task, what we see is that that pattern I showed where you basically smile when you, let's see back here, this pattern where you basically reinforce mutual cooperation by showing pleasure at mutual cooperation. When you have taken advantage of another person, try to repair that cooperation by showing guilt, and then reinforcing the norm of cooperation by showing anger when that norm has been violated. So agents that across a number of different tasks that kind of show this pattern are effective at increasing cooperation rates. There's, of course, that's just these expressions. There's a whole lot of other things around trust and transparency. And of course, if you use these expressions, but they're disconnected from the actual strategy, it'll backfire. So you can get away with showing you're guilty at screwing someone over once, but if you screw them over multiple times and keep showing, oh, I'm sorry, then it actually has a backfire effect and can lead to less cooperation than showing no expression at all.
Okay, we have a third question from Henry Lieberman. Unless I missed something, I didn't hear you talk about iterated PD, where cooperation is dominant. That explains why people are more cooperative than game theory gives them credit for, even if the game setup isn't iterated.
Yeah, so the task we had here was an iterated prison's dilemma with a finite horizon. And so from game theory, if there is a finite horizon, it actually still is the dominant strategy, at least from game theory, is mutual defection. But in some sense, that's irrelevant to the human participants don't know game theory, right? They're just doing whatever they're trying to do. And so we're trying to look at how does both the action policy of the partner and the expression policy of the partner influence the cooperation rate. So we're trying to unpack those processes and find that, in fact, game theory probably has not that much to contribute in terms of insights for the human psychology around this.